Man's Best Friend. Written by Alex Kirk. Read by Ben Miller.
Here begins a tale, a dog's tale. And this tale belonged to a wise old dog called Copernicus. An unusual name, you might think, but the dog's owner was a very unusual man. Neville Jebediah Smith lived in Victorian England with his poor widowed mother. He had a typical Victorian bookkeeping job, and as he was fast approaching middle age, his mother was desperate for him to find himself a wife and start a family. Well, nothing too unusual in that, you might think. Bachelor, nagging mother, boring job, dog with a funny name. But Neville was also an amateur scientist, and quite frankly, a bloody genius. He was a bit like a 19th century Professor Brian Cox, but without the qualifications or the hairdo. Neville had long been a writer of scientific papers which he sent off to the Royal Society of Science down in London. He outlined his new inventions and discoveries, but much to his chagrin, nothing came of it. If only they'd actually read the papers properly, then we'd have had nuclear power, the internet, and a cure for the common cold long before Queen Victoria had even popped her clogs. But no, the idiots assigned his genius to the rubbish pile. So time passed by, as it must. Neville's mother was still going on about him getting married, so much so that all he now heard was a sort of white noise as she gabbed and gabbed. As soon as Neville returned home from work, he'd head out for long walks in the countryside with faithful Copernicus at his side. Neville would explain all the workings of the world, how the planets span round the sun, how the blood pumped round the human body, reciting the periodic table backwards just for fun. As you might have guessed, Neville's mind was on far higher things than marriage. And as the weekends came around, Neville and Copernicus would be catching pretty green frogs together. Then back in the rickety shed-cum laboratory at the bottom of the garden, Neville would humanely kill the frogs with a hammer, dissect them, and explain the central nervous system to his ever-attentive dog. Now, it was on one of their walks that the pair met a stranger. A beautiful woman stranger sitting upon a horse, no less. Her name was Montserrat Bligh, and she was lost. "I'm heading to Whitby," she said. "Would you be so kind as to point me in the right direction?" "Oh, what a divine little dog." Neville was just about to give his own name and offer to draw a map when Copernicus suddenly barked at the grand horse, causing the creature to rear up. This in turn sent the beautiful Montserrat Bligh crashing down, where she swiftly landed upon and crushed poor Copernicus, before then hitting her head upon a rock. Neville froze. His mind whirred in horror at what lay before him, until he did as any right-thinking Victorian gentleman would do. He pushed the woman off his beloved dog and carried him back to his shed. Naturally, Neville then went back for Montserrat and tried to save both of their lives using every ounce of medical knowledge he had. But it was to no avail. Neville's tear-rivened face gazed down at Copernicus's smashed, useless body, and Montserrat, in beautiful repose, but with a brain beyond repair. What was he to do? Well, simply transplant Copernicus's fine canine brain into the fine body of Montserrat, of course. He'd been transplanting the brains of frogs into toads since he was 12, but now here was a chance to prove his mettle on far more complex subjects. Wasn't easy, even for a genius, and Neville pushed hard at the twin envelopes of science and believability, but after many hours, the operation was complete. The next day, as Montserrat lay recovering in the shed, a little funeral was held at the bottom of the garden. The brainless body of Copernicus was laid to rest, to the confused feelings of his owner. Neville's mother was, to say the least, unmoved, and merely said, "Perhaps you'll have time to find yourself a wife now," before turning on her heels and marching back to the cottage to boil up a scrag end of mutton. All Neville's free time was now devoted to his lovely dog-brained woman. As soon as Neville returned from work, he was straight down to the shed to care for Montserrat. And then the day came when the wound was finally healed. He removed the bandages, saw her pretty eyes open, and then, joy of joys, Montserrat barked for the first time. Neville, overcome, patted her head and gave her a spoonful of Brunel's finest Victorian dog food, and they gazed out at the setting sun together. Over the following months, Neville and Montserrat worked hard together. She had to learn to walk upright, speak English, and not wee in the corner, for starters. But the old Copernicus was a very bright dog indeed, and inside his new human body, his brain developed, grew, and became aware of the amazing possibilities of joining the human race. As soon as she was proficient in a basic vocabulary, Neville took a deep breath, crossed his fingers, and presented Montserrat to his dumbstruck mother. "So very pleased to meet you," said Montserrat, offering her lace-gloved hand. Neville's mother sat down hard. She could hardly believe it. Her son with a woman, and not only that, but a beautiful woman of such obvious good breeding. She was so overjoyed a smile cracked her face for the first time since the relief of mafficking. Tea was made, and Montserrat sat in polite silence as Neville told his mother all about his new lady. He lied, obviously. He was hardly going to tell her that he'd whipped the brain out of his dog and slipped it into the body of a comatose woman, was he? No. He made up some story of how Montserrat was an orphan daughter of a Harrogate vicar, and she'd just left finishing school. And all went according to plan, with only a brief moment of concern as a cat walked past the window and Montserrat jumped up with the intention of herring after it. It was only Neville's quick thinking by taking her arm and showing her his mother's new curtains that saved the day. In fact, Montserrat was such a success that a wedding was planned to the joy of the whole village. Everyone agreed that Montserrat was the perfect Victorian wife, obedient, loyal, and barely uttered a word, especially when the men were talking. Oh, in case you're wondering if Montserrat was missed, then yes, she was. Briefly, but she only had a father, and she told him that she was going to set up a new life in Paris. He would have expected a postcard, but he'd drunkenly fallen down the steps of the Leeds trolleybus one Friday evening and died instantly. Quite a disaster-prone family, really. So, it looked like the happy couple would live happily ever after. Without children, of course. That would be disgusting. But then, on one of their idyllic walks, with Neville talking animatedly about the life cycle of the yellow-billed cuckoo, Montserrat suddenly said, 3 to 4 eggs, incubated over a period of 14 days or less. Neville quite literally took a step back and banged his head on a branch. Of course, Montserrat's new cerebral cortex had spent many years inside the wise head of Copernicus, and he'd been listening to his master very carefully, so all that knowledge had been absorbed by his fine brain. Montserrat now not only took an interest in Neville's amateur science, but was also genuinely interested in learning for herself. At first, Neville encouraged his wife, and he began to teach her all he knew. But then it slowly became apparent that Montserrat was the cleverer of the two. Her dog brain was now starting to grow, develop, and gain a huge thirst for knowledge, such that it outpaced even the genius of its benefactor. Neville grew bitter that his ex-canine friend and now wife was becoming more intelligent than he, and those long evenings in the shed were increasingly becoming dominated by Montserrat, as she held forth on the science of plate tectonics or the possibilities of cold fusion. Yes, a dark, hateful ball of resentment was building in the man's gut. The only pleasure he had, his only remaining shred of power over his wife, was that Montserrat, despite all her intelligence, could not resist Neville shouting, "Walkies!" His dark heart fizzed as he watched his wife fall to her hands and knees, her tongue loll and her little bottom wag as she reverted to her doggy nature. No canine can resist a walkies. This was the only thing keeping the woman in check and not getting ideas above her station. And then, one chill winter's evening, Montserrat suddenly announced that she'd been invited to give a lecture at the Royal Society of Science in London. She'd sent a couple of papers to them, and they were interested in her theories on frequency and acoustic engineering. She was to be the first woman allowed to present a lecture. No prizes for guessing that Neville was against the idea and forbade it. Montserrat would have complained, but Neville quickly silenced her with a "Walkies," and down she went, doggy style. But then, some days later, after breakfast, Neville suddenly said that he'd been giving it some thought, and she should indeed go. He would not only give his blessing, but be in the audience, supporting her. A strange about-face, thought Montserrat. The day of the lecture came, and Montserrat was up on stage with Neville sitting in the front row with a fixed grin on his face and a half-formed plan up his sleeve. Just as his wife began to present her lecture on the science of sound, Neville jumped up. "Gentlemen, I have a far more important discovery. I have performed the first brain transplant. And not only that, but it has been a success." Montserrat looked horrified. Yet she'd expected this very moment, and her hand quickly but imperceptibly hovered over a small bakelite dial fixed on the desk. Neville wagged a finger in the air and continued, "Gentlemen, this woman has the brain of my dog." Now there were a few titters building to outright laughter. Neville got angry and panicky and tried to explain what had happened. As two large gents approached the stage, Montserrat's senses were on high alert, and she quietly turned the dial on the desk. Just as the gentleman took him by the arm, Neville seized upon the inevitable last straw and shouted, "No, I can prove it. Walkies!" he yelled at Montserrat. But to no reaction from her. Aghast, he yelled again, "Walkies!" But mysteriously, Montserrat resisted, and Neville was dragged off the stage, screaming that he was the genius, and his wife was a bloody bitch! Montserrat continued with her lecture, and demonstrated, by now revealing and turning the little bakelite dial on the desk, her new discovery of ultra-high frequency sound that only affects young adults or even, ironically, dogs. "Indeed, as I turn this dial, we, of course, can hear nothing. But should any members of the canine family be in the room, then they would hear naught else but a high-pitched, deafening shrill of some 40,000 hertz." The audience all applauded. The lady was a triumph. She smiled innocently. Yet all she could hear was a single shrill, high-pitched note, as, to her, the audience applauded in apparent silence. Montserrat went on to become the High Priestess of the Royal Society of Science and lived a very happy and fulfilled life, trotting the globe and amassing a huge fortune from inventing a special high-pitched whistle that shepherds use to control their dogs. But what of Neville Jebediah Smith? What became of him? Well, sadly, or maybe not so sadly, he was thrown into Bedlam, where he ranted and raved about swapping brains from dogs to ladies and back again, until the doctors finally got bored of him and decided to perform the very first lobotomy in the world, which I think you'll agree was an absolute success. So there we are. It just goes to show, you might not be able to teach an old dog new tricks, but you sure can take his brain and put it in the body of a human. It's just that no one will believe you. And it's wrong, really, isn't it?